Today, I want to talk about modulating intensity for CrossFit training. And I think it would be helpful if I started with just a working definition. Here, I'm thinking just about how to adjust or keep proper control. It's also defined as exerting a controlling influence on. So basically, we can figure out how we can regulate how hard or easy an athlete is actually going specific to their CrossFit training. And we'll define what CrossFit training is too, because that's obviously subjective and it's open-ended and there's a lot that can fall in that. So I think it would be helpful if we cleared that up a little bit. But basically, I want to start off on kind of clear off the two ends of the spectrum that are a little bit more straightforward in terms of an approach, which would be the strength training and the endurance end of things. Not that training for those things is easy or necessarily straightforward, but there's a lot more history around those things. And generally, there's a lot more education out there already on how to regulate intensity. And there's a number of different ways. I'm going to cover some of that today. However, I kind of want to check off those first, and then we'll figure out how you can adjust for CrossFit specifically. So today I want to go through how you can modulate intensity for CrossFit training. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. So as I explain this, I thought it would be helpful if I had examples, and I also thought it'd be cool if I pulled real examples from my athletes' training. So I'm not going to give you their names. However, I am going to actually put it up. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm actually going to screenshot their actual whole block of training, but just kind of highlight the chunk that I'm talking about, and I'll also verbally kind of explain it and go over it. So as I said, we're going to start with the spectrums, the strength and the endurance, and then we'll kind of go ends to middle, where we're actually doing a lot more of the CrossFit work, which is typically a blend of strength and conditioning, and obviously be a lot of different things. So strength work, one way that you can modulate intensity would just be with percentages. So someone's done a 1 rep max back squat before, so you can figure out what 70% of their best ever back squat was. Again, it's helpful if you have at least an understanding of someone's current maxes and how that could be raised or lowered based on like the recovery state that they're currently in. However, at least having a rough idea of where that person's at is obviously going to be super helpful. So here's an example from one of my athletes training. A was a 12-minute EMOM, a no foot power snatch with a slow pull till the knee. So in other words, they're not actually lifting their feet off the ground and moving them, and they're slowing down that first pull up until, as it says, the knee. And then they're going to do a no feet power snatch. And again, that's going to be at 65 to 70%. So again, more form focused, relatively light. And then I want them to note the RPE when they actually finish that work. B will be then a 10-minute EMOM of a no feet hang power clean, again at 65 to 70% of their best clean. Again, and typically when I write percentage work for weightlifting, unless I say otherwise, it's usually based on their full lift. For example, they're doing power snatches. However, it's based on however they can snatch the most weight, right? Typically for most people, that's going to be a squat snatch. Same thing for, in this case, it was a hang power clean. They're going to be basing that off their full clean, again, unless I say otherwise. And then C was a snatch pull to hip. And that was 6 sets of 4 reps at 117% of their 1RM snatch, that was pretty deep into progression. So that's obviously a pretty heavy snatch pull. Again, they're noting the load and the RPE at finish. RPE, rating of perceived exertion. That's something that I kind of, as you see, kind of going back and forth between. And that's sort of another way that I will typically do this. So one way would be percentage-based work. Second would be RPE, rating of perceived exertion. I use a scale of just 1 to 10, and they can use decimals if they want, like 7.5 out of 10, for example. Here's another example. Different athlete. A, low hang snatch. They're building to RPE 9 for a single. And then after that, they're doing power snatches at 7 sets of 1.1, meaning they're doing a single. They'll drop and reset and do another single. And they're supposed to be performing those all at RPE 7 to 8. So all 7 of those sets are supposed to be at a moderately heavy load across. And again, that could change if they're feeling like garbage. Obviously, that is going to vary, whereas percentage work is going to be static throughout. So it kind of depends. Also, it gives rating perceived exertion work gives a little bit more auto-regulation ability based on the athlete and how they're feeling in a particular day. However, if you want them to hit certain, weights or percentages, then obviously you need to actually make sure it's specific to that athlete. And a good example of that would be C for this athlete, where they were doing snatch grip deadlifts to like a low hang position, 4 sets of 8 reps, and I prescribed sort of a weight, but I give them a little bit of a range. 205 to 225 was the range. Another way that you can do strength work, and I really like doing this for more gymnastics-based protocols or things that are more upper body centric, where you're typically going to be in a little bit higher of a rep range and not often doing like singles and doubles as much for like pull-ups and that sort of thing. It's usually more capacity-based work, and that's as a result of how CrossFit historically has been tested. So a really way that I like to do that a lot is reps in reserve. So for example, you could write this as like AMRAP -1. So as many reps as possible in an unbroken set, stopping one before the point that you would fail. That's what AMRAP -1 means in this case. So here's the example from one of my athletes. Every 2 minutes for 8 sets. The odd sets, they're doing AMRAP -1 of strict handstand push-ups. And the even sets, they're doing AMRAP -1 of strict pull-ups. So technically, every time they come back to a pushing or pulling movement, they've had, it's been 4 minutes since they've done that set. So they probably had a solid 3.5 minutes of rest or so. So they should be good recovery between each of those, because those are super challenging sets if you're going to AMRAP -1. So that's probably the 3 most common ways that I kind of auto-regulate or modulate strength work intensity. For endurance work, first of all, just be like fixed paced work, right? So if you're writing, for example, in this case, it was a 45-minute clock, 250 meter row at a 203 to 205 pace at a damper 4. They're walking 2 by 100 feet as rest in between each of those. And I'm just gonna have them tell me the total meters once they get done. And it's something that is supposed to be sort of like moderate zone work, not super challenging stuff. So obviously you could base that off their 5K and say like 5K minus 2 to 3 seconds or something along those lines, which I also do, or like 10-minute test average wattage minus 10 to 20 watts or something along those lines, right? You could always put it around that, but that's all going to be fixed paced work. You could also do it off perceived effort, which again is going to vary day to day. Here's an example. Every 3 minutes for 9 sets, 250 meter run, and then row until the 2-minute mark, where the first 3 sets are at 60% effort. The sets 4 through 7 are 70% effort, and sets 8 and 9 are 90% effort. So again, the effort is ramping, and the performance should probably increase a little bit across each of those. Like they should probably get a little bit better of a row score in terms of like the meters that they're collecting across that. But again, it's based on what they're perceiving as their effort, which could shift day to day. Another way that you could do this is with heart rate zones, which I've just released a podcast not too long ago about that. So if you're curious, you can head back and check out that one. But here, like a super simple example, this is, again, I wrote this for somebody, but it's very simple. 25-minute C2 bike at zone 2, right? And the time only counts when you're actually in zone 2. Things as simple as that. You could also use some other modulators, which I really like. One would just be like nasal breathing. So for example, 2K row to nasal cap, right? It's sort of like a finisher for the day, or in this case, it was like part of a recovery day, and they did that several times, like multiple 2Ks at a nasal cap. We're saying like you could go as hard or as easy as you want, but you have to make sure that you keep your mouth shut. We're actually on the rower. So that's sort of like strength and endurance. Let's go to more of the middle. And again, typically here, if I'm saying like CrossFit, I'm talking about CrossFit mixed work. Doesn't have to necessarily be MetCons. However, it certainly could be. Every 8 minutes for 3 sets, this would be our first example, is a 3-minute AMRAP at 90% or a hard effort. 20 burpee box get-overs, and then max overhead squats in the remaining time. So again, you can just see based on like the work-rest ratio that's obviously going to be able to be higher effort work, right? They're getting 5 minutes of rest and they're only working for 3 minutes. However, it's also verbalized in language and effort in terms of it being a high effort, but then also saying like this is supposed to be a hard pace. So it's reinforcing to the athlete what the intention behind that work is. And it gives them like a model of how to start to think about and how to prepare mentally for a piece that they're attacking it in the correct way. Another example, 5 rounds of 60% effort, 20 calorie biker, 2 ring muscle ups, and then immediately into the next piece, which is 5 rounds at 85% effort of a 20 calorie bike erg and 3 bar muscle ups. Again, one of the things that is important to realize is that effort is going to be based on the modalities that the person is doing and how proficient they are in those movements. If we're talking about CrossFit, right? If it's just running and someone's a runner, obviously they're going to be able to go right up against their capacity. However, if you have all these different skills, it's something that you need to be a little bit more tactile on how you go about actually prescribing that sort of work. So in this case, obviously a strict ring muscle up is a, very high complexity, high strength driven movement. So you need to be able to be a little bit more reserved in how you go about attacking a piece like that, especially if you're not someone who has had a ton of exposure in that sort of a movement. So 60% isn't going to be crazy, right? Whereas 85%, you're now doing a kipping movement, is going to be way closer to that ceiling, and like your total systemic work rate is going to be significantly higher in those 5 rounds versus the first 5. And again, that's something that athlete has sort of built up to, and they're capable of doing that. But then also they understand that this is sort of where my capacity is at, in the strict variation and then the kipping variation on the bar. I would say even simpler than like writing this sort of perceived effort work or giving some language about how to attack a piece would just be like modulating work rest, where it's going to be appropriate for an athlete. So things like EMOMs every 90 seconds, every 2 minutes, right? Where it's a sort of a, maybe not a fixed work ratio, because it could be a little bit variable based on how you actually write that. And actually sometimes like writing, EMOMs where it's a fixed amount of work in the EMOM. So for example, like a 12-second bike on the minute, which is basically like a desaturation protocol. However, you could also do it where it's 10 calories, and it's going to be variable in terms of how long it takes someone to get through that. But you just need to be aware of the work rest ratio and how you're thinking about that as you're actually writing it for the athlete, like thinking about the athlete, how long is this probably going to take them, and then sort of working backwards from there about how long the work rest ratio should be, and then how much volume when you give them, because that's obviously going to change how they can pace it. So an example was that I recently gave to an athlete some like aerobic repeatability intervals every 3 minutes for 12 to 14 sets, 4 dumbbell box step-ups to 20 inches, 35 a hand, and then 4 box jump overs to that same 20-inch box, 8 GHD sit-ups, 5 thrusters at 65, and 5 calories on the rower. There is a cap at the 130 mark of each interval, because I don't want that work rest ratio bleeding over a 1-to-1. I want to keep it at or below that 1-to-1 to keep the intensity higher and to make sure that they're not having power output dip as they get past it. If for some reason I wasn't able to appropriately figure out where their capacity was going to be at that day, or for whatever reason they're just not feeling as great on that particular day. So those are all the reasons why I do that kind of thing. You can see it's a bunch of small chunks of work, which allows the turnover to stay a little bit higher, and it allows them to get a bunch of different patterns in, because if you're doing 12 to 14 sets of almost anything, that's a lot of work. And if you're already hitting some of those patterns, like, likely you're doing some sort of lower body work already in the week, you probably don't want to go crazy with box step ups and box jump overs and thrusters. So like, again, that's going to be a lot of contractions on the legs. So doing smaller chunks of that work rather than being like sets of 12 or 15, for example, it allows the heart rate to stay a little bit more level, but then it also allows them to have repeatability and not be destroyed for future training sessions, which is ultimately the goal of this sort of work. So those are like my big picture things when I think about writing the CrossFit work specifically. Is like, what's the work to rest ratio? What's the volume like? And then as a result, what is the intensity going to be able to be for that athlete? And then how does that sort of fit into their overall picture of the week? And that really gives you a pretty good idea of like, what sort of thing do I need to verbalize to them so that they are attacking this in the right way, where they can get their optimal stimulus and dosing out of the week, and not something where they're going to be overreaching too early because they don't understand that, hey, you got a lot more work coming. And like, again, that varies a little bit. If you have a more mature athlete that you're working with, someone who's been around a while, they're more of a veteran athlete, they're going to understand that I can't go crazy because there is 12 to 14 sets of work here. I need to be patient in how I attack that work. And even though it is going to be high intensity, I need to be more diligent, methodical about how I go about that work. Whereas a younger, less experienced athlete might not have that same kind of awareness about how they should be attacking work. So me as a coach, I need to do more legwork about educating them on how they should be thinking about and attacking pieces of work and training, and also just giving them more exposures of certain types of training allows them to calibrate and to figure out how I should be attacking this sort of work. I made a joke the other day about at the gym, we did every 3 minutes for 10 sets, and it was, this bout of work, and then it ended at the 130 mark. So it was 130 on, 130 off, and almost everybody went way too hot in that first interval and just kind of paid for it the rest of the time. We came back after several weeks of doing those types of progressions, and we did the exact same workout, which I don't often do, like test retest stuff, especially in like more of a conditioning based format like that. That's like really challenging. However, I wanted to sort of make a point of like, if you pace this correctly, it can be way better. And just people's understanding of what the volume is and how they should be pacing it completely changed, even if it wasn't something that they could verbalize. And just the way that they went about attacking the work, they're much more patient and diligent and methodical, like I was mentioning, and they're able to then kind of extend the work bout across a much more even, their scores are way more even and consistent throughout, which is ultimately the goal. So those are some of the ideas that I think about of how you can regulate intensity. This was meant to be in no way exhaustive, but I do hope it shed at least some light onto how you can modulate intensity for CrossFit training. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.